Thank you all for virtually attending the Meet the Artist public meeting for the Berwyn Station. My name is Brian Weslowski. I am part of the community outreach team for the Red and Purple Modernization Phase 1 project, and I will be moderating for this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few items. As you can see, we have live ASL interpretation this evening. We will also be recording this meeting to share on the project's website so you can refer back to it or share it with others. We will have a presentation, including an introduction of the artists, and then a Q&A in which we will be taking questions and comments live regarding the public art for the new stations. If you have a question or comment during the presentation or Q&A, please write it in the chat box. We will be recording all questions and comments for review and consideration as it relates to the public art for the stations. Please note that we will only be focusing on public art this evening. If you have construction questions, please email us at rpm@transitchicago.com. I'd like to hand it over to Tammy Chase to kick off this meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Tonight, we're going to go over a number of topics related to RPM and station art. We'll do first a project overview, just a short summary of what our Red Purple Modernization Phase 1 is. We'll also provide you an overview of the CTA art program across our system, as well as how we selected the artists for the new Red and Purple Modernization stations. You will hear from the artists selected for the Berwyn station, David Lozano, and that will be followed by a community question and answer session. This is your time to ask questions, provide comments, learn more about the art program and the artist. So let's do a quick overview of what the Red Purple Modernization Program is. We call it RPM. You'll hear us say RPM a lot throughout this presentation. Is a program to rebuild the Red and Purple Line stations and tracks from Belmont on the south to Linden on the north end. This is about a 10-mile corridor. So we are building this project in multiple phases. Currently, we're building phase 1, as I mentioned just a minute ago. That includes 3 major components. First component is what we're here to talk about tonight is the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr modernization that rebuilds the Lawrence, Argyle, Berwyn, and Bryn Mawr Red Line stations, as well as more than a mile of track in between those facilities. And these are, in fact, the stations for which we have hired the artists, including Mr. Lozano, who you will hear from in a bit. The new stations are expected to open in 2025 and be fully accessible with elevators and escalators. The second piece of phase 1 work is the Red Purple Bypass project. That includes a new rail bypass north of Belmont that opened in 2021, and it's reconfigured where red, purple, and brown lines intersected. We've now begun the second piece of that work, which is to rebuild all of the Red and Purple Line tracks from Belmont almost all the way up to Addison. Those tracks are 100 years old, like the tracks we're building in Lawrence to Bryn Mawr. We're replacing, I should say, and so everything will be brand new track structure. The third important piece of this is corridor, what we call the corridor signal improvements. Basically, that's train traffic signals that we use to guide our trains and run our operations efficiently and safely. Next slide, please. Actually, before I go into the stations here, I do want to mention one thing. Tonight's meeting, as Brian mentioned, is about art, but we will have construction meetings in about 2 weeks, June 21st and 22nd, to give you a better look at where the project stands from a construction standpoint. If you don't already have that registration info, you feel free to send us a chat and we'll get that to you, or you can email us at rpm@transitchicago.com. So with that, we'll turn to the new stations. These are the artistic renderings of the stations that will be Lawrence on the top and then Argyle. Next slide, please. And on the top here, you'll see Berwyn, the station that we'll talk about tonight. And on the bottom is Bryn Mawr Station. And with that, I will turn this over to my colleague, Allison Connollyse, to talk about the CTA's art program. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. I'm Allison Coglanese, and I'm a project coordinator with the CTA Art Program. The Chicago Transit Authority incorporates quality design and construction projects, and from time to time commissions and installs the public art for CTA riders and the communities it serves. The CTA commissions professional artists to create original, site-specific artwork for permanent display in new and newly renovated transit facilities. Original artworks contribute to each station's identity and enhance travel for CTA customers, as well as regional, national, and international visitors. Next slide. The new commission artworks entered the art collection of the Chicago Transit Authority. Next slide. The CTA is home to an impressive collection of art, including mosaics, image transfer artworks, and sculptures. More than 100 artworks are exhibited at 65 CTA stations and are seen daily by CTA customers. The original artworks contribute to each location's identity and enhance travel for customers. Art in CTA facilities promotes a friendly, inviting atmosphere for these locations, which function as gateways to the communities they serve. For more information about CTA and CTA's public art collection, visit transitchicago.com/art. Next slide. 5 art locations for the RPM Phase 1 project include Bryn Mawr Hollywood Station Auxiliary Entrance, Berwyn, Argyle, and Lawrence. Next slide. The CTA seeks to commission permanent contemporary artworks that are of superior artistic merit, relate to the station location and environment, provide an improved and more attractive transit experience, are original in concept and execution, and are fabricated of safe, highly permanent materials and processes, and also require minimal maintenance. Next slide. Call for artists. On February 23rd, 2022, CTA advertised a call for artists for the RPM art project for Lawrence, Argyle, Berwyn, and Bryn Mawr stations. The call for artists was open to all living artists, both emerging and established, with a background in 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional media and an interest in public art. Prior public art experience was not a requirement. The CTA received 166 responses. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Elizabeth Karpowitz.
Good evening. Sorry. Good evening. Sorry about that. Artist selection process. In reviewing and evaluating the responses to the call for artists, CTA considered the following factors, which are listed in order of importance, beginning with the most important: artistic merit as evidenced in submitted digital images, written statement of interest, professional recognition as evidenced by awards, honors, and exhibition records, and qualifications as evidenced by resume. A review committee reviewed the responses to the call for artists for completeness and minimum qualifications and eliminated non-viable responses. A review committee evaluated the remaining responses, determined a relative ranking of candidates based on an all-inclusive evaluation, and compiled a short list of candidates for the project. From the short list of candidates, a selection committee identified finalists for the station locations. Finalists were invited to negotiations and subsequently entered into a contract with CTA for the artwork commission. Selected artist responsibilities. The artists awarded a contract will be responsible to collaborate with CTA to design, fabricate, and deliver an original work of art of durable materials and that requires minimal maintenance. Among other requirements of the contract, the artist will be required to meet the project timeline and budget. Commissions. The 5 art commissions are for the design, fabrication, and delivery of art. The budget for each commission is $150,000. This is inclusive of design, engineering, if applicable, materials, fabrication, delivery of artwork, and an artist's fee of approximately 15 to 20% of the project budget. The timeline. Tonight and tomorrow night, we are hosting these Meet the Artist community meetings. Then the next phase begins this summer and continues through spring of 2024. And during this time, the artists will develop their artwork concepts and designs. In spring 2024 through 2025, approval of the artwork, fabrication, and delivery of the artwork will occur in collaboration with CTA. And in 2025, we anticipate the art to be installed and station openings. The RPM artists, we have 5 artists who have received commissions. William Conger for the Bryn Mawr Station, Alice Hargrave for the Bryn Mawr Station Hollywood Auxiliary Entrance, David Lozano for the Berwyn Station, Mayumi Lake for the Argyle Station, and Tom Torlumke for the Lawrence Station. So it is my privilege to introduce artist David Lozano, who will speak with you about his artwork, and he has a number of slides of work that he will discuss during his presentation. David?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. First, I want to say I'm honored and thrilled to be selected to design a piece for the Berwyn stop. And it's an interesting coincidence. When I first moved here in Chicago to go to graduate school at the University of Illinois here in Chicago, I happened to move in that neighborhood. I lived off of Carmen and Broadway. I was actually closer to Argyle, but if I wanted to, I could walk another block to the Berwyn stop. So this is kind of a sentimental surprise for me. I am actually from Houston, Texas. I got my bachelor's of fine arts from the University of Houston. While I was a student at the University of Houston, I was basically self-employed. I did a lot of commercial art projects. The early part of the 90s, I focused on pretty much just graphic design. And then I started doing more work, such as public art projects for the city of Houston, for the Blaffer Art Gallery, which is the gallery on campus at the University of Houston. I worked with the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, as well as the Contemporary Art Museum. And I worked on a major public art project with Frank Stella at the Moore's Opera House at the University of Houston campus. Next slide. So this work here is actually my unofficial thesis exhibition from undergrad in Houston. They didn't really have thesis exhibitions for undergraduate art students at the university, but a colleague of mine who was running a gallery space at a community college asked me to do this piece, and I got to do this as credit and for my, again, unofficial thesis exhibition. This piece was called, or this installation, I should say, is called Super Fabulous. And this definitely shows like a marrying or merging of the aesthetics of doing commercial graphic work and marrying that with more conceptual ideas that I was exploring while I was in undergrad. So here you see basically 2 rooms done with the subversion of pop cultural references of the superhero. This was around 1999, so this was before the superhero genre became very popular in Hollywood. And one room was done in a high-key color palette, so very light colors, very saturated color. And then the other gallery room was done in a lower key color palette. And the ceilings are about 9 feet tall, just to give you an idea of the size of the space. I cannot remember the square footage. I think it was maybe about 1,300 square feet. Next slide. Here are 2 images of the same piece for a public art project in Houston. And this happened just about a year before I moved away from Houston to come here to Chicago for graduate school, 2001. This was for a brand new project that the city was doing for signage that was posted throughout the downtown area. This was wayfinding signage that pretty much were these billboards giving directional instructions for motorists, but all the streets downtown are one-way streets. So the other side of the signage would be empty. And so they came up with this idea to commission artists to create pieces for this wayfinding signage project. This piece was designed for the brand new ballpark, which is now Minute Maid Park in Houston. And as many of you all know, that Houston, or actually Clear Lake, which is just outside of Houston, is the home of NASA. So I came up with this idea of doing what I called a baseball satellite for this public art project. So it's the moon with red thread. Next slide. This piece is an example of the work that I began exploring soon after I graduated here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I would say that the majority of the work for around the first 10, 12 years of moving to Chicago, I would identify it as figurative abstraction. So there are references of the figure or silhouettes or other components of the body that would be alluded to in the work. And this would be combined with domestic elements, such as references to wood grain or a bed sheet or a pattern on a quilt and so forth. The previous piece that I had just shown with the baseball satellite, I wanted to just talk a moment about the subject matter of like the cosmos and outer space and planets. I've always been fascinated about the genre of the sublime, and that, and I'm talking about a classical idea of the sublime by the philosopher Edmund Burke. And in a nutshell, basically what it meant to me was a kind of beautiful terror, like watching a tornado from a position of safety. So it was something that could be beautiful and terrifying at the same time. So this idea of the sublime was something I became obsessed with during graduate school and the years after. And there'll be elements in these paintings that were very layered. So I would use the classical canon of imagery of the sublime, which would be something like an electrical storm, for instance, or the cosmos. And here in this painting would begin with an electrical storm that was painted in shades of green. Then I would pour resin over the imagery, and then I would paint over the remaining part of the painting. So you only see just a sliver of the electrical storm in the green. That's kind of a rivulet in the middle of this painting. And then I would begin layering with impasto and other elements. And then I'd finish off with the sequins. And this piece was called No Place Like Home. And I named it, when I finished graduate school, everything kind of fell into place here. I'm a faculty at the School of the Art Institute. I got that position 2004, I believe. And I met my partner. We moved in together in 2005. And so this piece was in celebration of my new life here in Chicago. So it's called No Place Like Home. It's 5 feet by 5 feet. Next slide. Again, similar process. There is resin and there are motifs again that are recurring, which are pattern motifs. When I left Houston, Texas, a friend of mine gave me a book on William Morris. And so I'd studied his designs and his ideas about elevating craft and making it an art as opposed to just something that was like a lowbrow aesthetic. And since, as you can see with the previous work, like Super Fabulous, I have always been interested in what I call high-low aesthetic. So lowbrow meaning very mundane, common, crafty materials such as sequins or patterns and so forth. This piece is about 4 feet by 4 feet. I'm using acrylic, oil, resin, and sequins. Next slide. And then shortly, a few years after I graduated, I was invited by the curator at Hyde Park Art Center to do an exhibition. And the curator saw that the work I did in Houston, that I was capable of doing a site-specific installation, and challenged me to come up with something for the walls and the window at the entrance of the art center. And I said, I'm willing to do that if I can still exhibit paintings that I've done, and was very excited to show. So I was able to have both and showed the paintings that were, some of them were actually part of the installation. As you can see in the bottom right, that painting is 6 feet by 6 feet. And then the imagery is exploring ideas of intimacy or imagined intimacy. Again, you can see in the painting on the right, there's these storm clouds underneath the resin and bed sheets. And I was exploring this idea again about the sublime, but equating it to queer sexuality and the fear of AIDS, since I grew up during this horrific time of seeing many of my peers suffer. So this was definitely at the forefront of my mind, again, during graduate school and the few years after. Next slide. And then I did an about face, but still used the William Morris motifs and just started using them a little bit more outright. I also started incorporating elements that were popularized by modernist painters. The drip has always been prevalent in the work. Again, I would call modernist painters the painters like from the 50s and early 60s that explored the itself as content to kind of a more process oriented to see what paint can do. And the other modernist element was the minimalism or minimalist art. And so, as I mentioned before, I did work with Frank Stella. So I'm kind of paying homage to the drip and the square within square paintings that Frank Stella was famous for. But I kind of turned that on its head by incorporating the perforated wood, which was called, I call it Madeira Picado, which is inspired by the papel picado, which you would see the colorful banners in Mexican restaurants. So again, I'm playing around with a high-low and kind of challenging the idea of what makes fine art, and am trying to even the playing field, so to speak, by combining these different elements together. This piece is 4 feet by 6 feet, and I created this right around the time, around a little after 2016, I believe, and it's called Hope, which I thought we desperately needed around this time. Next slide. These are two vertical pieces which were a challenge for me since the format was very, very unusual. These are 22 inches by 55 inches. And again, using the recurring motifs, I was exploring actual dimensional imagery with airbrushing, and then also thinking about just flattening the picture plane with the painting on the right. The picture on the left is kind of another interesting coincidence because it's called Rockwell. And that is, I believe, a security camera at the Rockwell train stop that's in silhouette in front of a sunset. Next slide. This piece is about 4 feet by 6 feet again. It's resin and acrylic only, no oil in this one. These are, again, 1/2 inch laser cut wood, and I'm calling these Madeira picados. So perforated wood, if you will. And this one's a celebration of my younger days of going dancing on Saturday nights at a club called Riches in Houston, Texas. So that's a mirrored ball. And the acrylic on the left side of this painting is basically like dripped on. And so it has a very tactile quality, which I've always been interested in my surfaces, again, with the sequins or impasto, which is really thick paint, or it may even use enamel, which is super glossy. So the surfaces are very tactile. Next slide. This one's called Blue Peony, and 4 feet by 6 feet. So we have acrylic resin on the right, and then 2 different kinds of William Morris patterns that are superimposed over each other. One's a red design, and one's in the blue palette. The stripes are done in oil. Everything's done in acrylic except for the stripes. And again, it has a kind of a textured surface. I purposely want the strokes to show. So again, it's something to see in person. It has a tactile quality with contrast between the surface of each element. Next slide. And I believe this is the final slide, maybe. This is a newer work where I'm trying to just go beyond the, even the recent wood cutouts were somewhat rectangular, even though they had an organic shape. And I was challenging myself to break out of that and just do a completely organic shapes. And again, playing around with process and contrast with different surface qualities. So this piece is around 4 feet by 4 feet. The wall is actually painted in the oval, and the rest of it is wood cutouts. And again, there are different surface qualities for each element. Enamel to granular gel with the red, and then there's like beaded acrylic in the pink section and so forth. And next, I think that might be it. Yeah.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Karpowitz again from the CTA art program. Oh, I'm in darkness here. Anyway, David, thank you very much. That was a terrific explanation of your your history as an artist and also your process and your aesthetic. For the community members in attendance, we will now open the floor for a question and answer period. And some things to think about as you enter your questions into the chat box. Highlights of the history of your community. This could be valuable and interesting information for David. Are there special features of your community that you would like to talk about or raise awareness of? And then suggestions for themes or other ideas that David might take into consideration as he is developing his artwork proposal for CTA. So Jason, I'm sorry, Brian, well, I'll turn it to you. David, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so while we wait for the current attendees to provide some questions or comments, I do have some questions that arrived during registration prior to the meeting. So I'll start with this one. Does your work include photographs?
I use transfers. So, that's kind of not really a photograph, but I will use transfers. I didn't have any examples in these slides here, but the original submission to CTA, they do have some examples of work where I use transfers, and these are from like local periodical magazines and so forth.
Thank you. I have another question, kind of a two-parter. What materials and processes might be used, and can graffiti be easily removed?
Yeah, I think that might be a question for the CTA, as they have approved materials and processes for the artists to use.
Yes, that's correct. The CTA has a sort of a limited list of materials that we endorse for the artwork because it is durable and will last over the years, and it is also resistant to damage and to graffiti. We ask artists to work in materials that are either graffiti resistant or that can be cleaned in the same manner that other surfaces in our transit facilities are cleaned. So the artists will be given a list of materials that CTA feels are appropriate. The artist may also suggest other types of materials that maybe CTA has not thought about, that CTA can give consideration to, but always durability and longevity and the ability for the work to be cleaned are critical for CTA, because we want this art to last for decades.
Great. Also, actually, to our current attendees, you are welcome to raise your hand and speak as well. You can find the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. I have another question from registration. How does the venue being a train station instead of a building or museum influences what art you might create?
That's an interesting question. Yeah. I'm at the beginning stages of this, and that is like I am just now thinking about that. And now that you planted that seed, that is something to think about as far as this idea of it being a train station. I don't know. I will think about that.
Fair enough. Good. Those were the only questions I had from registration. I'm not necessarily seeing any in the chat box or hands raised at the moment, so we'll give a few more minutes to allow for anyone to think of anything, or comments too, please.
So, Brian, as we're waiting, I would like to ask David a question, or ask you to elaborate. You made reference to that you're being inspired and influenced by William Morris's work, and I wondered if you might talk a little bit more about who William Morris was and what he was famous for in case people in the audience aren't familiar with his work. Thanks.
Yeah. William Morris was a designer in England, I believe, during the Victorian era. So at just before the end of the 19th century, and I understand that when he was younger, I think he had an illness that prevented him from being very mobile, and he just would look out in nature and be inspired by nature itself. And so, yeah, he explored textile, upholstery design, wallpaper design, again, during the Victoria era, that is now, since it's so old, is public domain as far as using his work. So yeah, he was interested in this idea of how to take craft and design and elevate that and make that a respected art form with a capital A, which I think he achieved. He's a highly respected, anyone in the design industry, whether architects or interior designers, definitely have a high regard for his designs.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we do have a question from the chat box from Kathleen. Will there be unveilings or receptions to introduce the artwork when the stations are completed? It's probably a CTA question.
That is definitely a CTA question. Tammy, has there been discussion on RPM's side about when the stations are open, how that will occur? Oftentimes we will pre-COVID, I will say, when artworks have been finished in our stations that are usually stations that have undergone a renovation, we definitely do a media announcement, and on occasion we will have sort of like a ribbon cutting in a very small event there at the station lobby, because the RPM stations are new and there's a rollout of the completion and the opening of them. I'm not sure we can answer that with any confidence at this time, but Tammy, I'll defer to you.
Sure. So, I mean, we look at, opening new stations as well as new art, wherever it is on the CTA system as a reason for celebration. Celebration of the community, celebration for our writers who come into the stations every day, see not just a station, not just a turnstile. They see art, they see an experience, even if they're seeing it for 30 seconds as they're running to their train. That's really important to us. So we will absolutely have community events to celebrate these things, and we hope lots of folks come.
Great question. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? I only have that one from the chat box. I don't see any hands raised at the moment.
David, it seems like your presentation was so complete that there are no questions. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and your work is really, it's so beautiful. And I personally think that your combination of contemporary imagery, layered with historic imagery and the William Morris, the vines and the lush vegetation. I think that this is really a great foundation for artwork that will enhance the Berwyn station, given that it's a residential area very close to the lake. So we welcome you to the CTA art program. Really look forward to what you imagine for the Berwyn station. So thank you so much for your presentation this evening.
You're welcome. I'm very excited to be part of it.
Great.
If we could have the last slide on the page, please. Thank you. So very exciting. Thank you all again for joining us this evening. On the screen in front of you, we have listed all the ways for you to reach out and stay informed on the project. As always, if you have any additional questions or comments regarding the public art or construction, please reach out via email at rpm@transitchicago.com. Please enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you for attending.